called on Israel, meaning the U.S. and Israel, to observe international law. The U.S. boycotted the meeting, thereby killing it. You can check the coverage again. These acts, again, contribute to the escalation of terrorism there, including its most severe component, and the media contributed in the usual way. Well, suppose, finally, that we join the Martian Observer. I'm skipping a lot of things I think are interesting. You can ask about them if you like. But suppose, finally, that we join the Martian Observer and we depart from convention radically. We accept moral truisms. If we can rise to that level, we can then, and only then, honestly raise the question of how to respond to terrorist crimes. One answer is to follow the precedent of law-abiding states, the Nicaraguan precedent, for example. Of course, that failed because they ran up against the fact that the world is ruled by force, not by law, but wouldn't fail for the U.S. However, evidently that's excluded. I have yet to see one phrase referring to that precedent in the massive coverage of the last couple of months. Another answer was given by Bush and Boyce, but we instantly reject that one because nobody believes that Haiti or Nicaragua or Cuba and a long list of others around the world have the right to carry out massive terrorist attacks against the United States and its clients or other rich and powerful states. A more reasonable answer was given by from a number of sources, including the Vatican, and was spelled out by the preeminent Anglo-American military historian, Michael Howard, last October. Actually, it's published in the current issue of Foreign Affairs. That's the leading establishment journal. Howard has all the appropriate credentials, a lot of prestige. He's a great admirer of the British Empire, even more extravagantly of its successor in global rule, so he can't be accused of moral relativism or other such crimes. Referring to September 11th, he recommended then a police operation against a criminal conspiracy whose members should be hunted down and brought before an international court where they could receive a fair trial and, if found guilty, be awarded an appropriate sentence. Well, that was never contemplated, of course, but sounds kind of reasonable to me. If it is reasonable, then it ought to hold for even worse terrorist crimes. For example, the U.S. International terrorist attack against Nicaragua, or even worse ones nearby and elsewhere, going up right to the present, incidentally. Well, that could never be contemplated, of course, but for opposite reasons. So honesty leaves us with a dilemma. The easy answer is conventional hypocrisy. The other option is the one adopted by our Martian friend, who actually abides by the principles that we profess with grand self-righteousness. That option is harder to consider, but imperative if the world is to be spared still worse disasters. Thanks.
The quicker we take our break, the quicker he comes back. We're going to take a 10-minute break. You can buy books and T-shirts, write out your questions. People will be going down here, a couple people picking up questions, and up there, and we're going to start again in 10 minutes. Stretch your legs. Thank you. Oh, the questions keep coming. I'll read them.
Okay.
What can we do as individuals and collectively do to change this pattern of U.S. abuses and murder? How can we engage and inspire those outside this hall being full of the already converted and privileged?
First of all, an apology. If I act as if I can't see you, that's because I can't see you. It's all black out there. I assume there must be people, but can't see any faces. Actually, first of all, there are plenty of people outside this hall who are pretty much the same. In fact, it's a very powerful current in the country and, in fact, throughout the world. There's plenty of evidence for that. As to what you can do about it, I think we all know the answer. I mean, ask yourself why we don't live under feudalism, or why we don't have slavery, or why women have some rights, or why there's some finally concern about trying to save the environment before we destroy it, or anything else you can think of back through history. There are no magic answers. There's only one answer. It's dedicated, committed, hard work. Educational, organizing, find the things that interest you, get involved in them. There's just no other way. That's the way it's been done all through history. It's had a lot of progress. Things can make a lot of terrible things in the world, but it's a lot better than it was. And those achievements have come by people who didn't just ask the question, but acted on the obvious answer. And there isn't going to be any other answer. There's no point asking. If anybody had thought of an answer, you would have heard it. And there isn't any. The answer is, just do it. And you know how to do it the same way everybody else does.
Here's another one. If bombing Afghanistan is the wrong way of going about solving terrorism, then what is a better alternative? Thanks.
Yeah. Well, first of all, we have to decide what we mean by terrorism. Do we mean by terrorism what the, say, U.S. Code means by terrorism? Or do we mean by terrorism the terrorism that they conduct against us? Okay. Those are, depending on what we mean, there are different answers. So are we hypocrites or not? We got to decide that first. Well, if we're not hypocrites, then one way to reduce terrorism doesn't solve it. One way to reduce terrorism is not to participate in it. That's an easy way. That doesn't take, doesn't take bombing, doesn't take embargoes. It just means stop participating in it. If you want to know what that means, let's say today, just take a look at the list of leading recipients of U.S. arms transfers in the world. Just run through the list, compare them with standard Human Rights Watch reports, and you'll find a way to reduce terrorism enormously. What about the terrorism of them against us? That is the minor part. Well, the terrorism of the week does exist. It's serious, could get a lot worse. If you look at official studies, technical studies, some of them government, some strategic analysts, some in the technical journals, you'll find that for years now, everyone has understood that the major terror threat against the United States is not missiles. No country is going to be crazy enough to launch a missile attack against the United States and ask for instant obliteration. But there is so the missile defense business you can forget about. It's just a cover for militarization of space projects, which are extremely dangerous. But there is a possibility of serious terrorist attacks, and it's not a joke. It doesn't take enormous expertise these days to figure out how to bring the pieces of a nuclear weapon into New York and assemble them in a hotel room and set off a nuclear explosion. In fact, even people with limited talent of most of us could figure out how to do that. And a plutonium bomb, weighs like 15 kilograms or something like that. And the same is true of bioterror and many other things. There are many possible weapons of the week, and there's a good chance that they'll be used. That's not the biggest part of component of terrorism. In fact, it's the smallest part, but it's very serious. Like what happened on September 11th wasn't a joke. So how do you deal with that? Well, there are a couple of ways. I mentioned a couple of ways at the end. And I think some of them are quite reasonable. I won't repeat. But the basic, somewhere along the line, if you want to deal with the problem with terrorism, you got to think about the reasons for it. So, for example, take, say, one of the very few cases in which the weak actually did carry out terrorism against the strong, namely IRA bombs in London, which were not a joke. I mean, at some stage they planned, didn't succeed in killing the whole British cabinet. Well, there was one possibility. I'm putting aside questions of feasibility. Let's put that aside. One possible reaction would, say, have been to bomb Boston, which is the source of most of the financing, I suppose. Well, okay, that would have been one response. Another response would have been to flatten West Belfast. Okay, probably the RAF could handle that. It wouldn't, even feasibility aside, those have been lunatic responses. Those are the responses we're doing now. A sensible response was the one that I quoted from Michael Howard. Find the perpetrators. It's a criminal act. Find the agents of the criminal act. Get evidence about them. Bring them to a proper court tribunal. And sentence them. And then, he didn't say this, and then look into the grievances that lie behind it. And there usually are grievances. I mean, any criminal act you think of, whether it's a robbery in the streets or September 11th or even worse terrorist crimes, of which there are unfortunately numerous, I gave a few cases, there's usually something that lies behind them. And when you look at what lies behind them, there often are, some of the grievances are quite legitimate. And they ought to be dealt with, quite apart from terrorism, independently of terrorism. So one of the things I didn't get to talk about, but could, is the question, why do they hate us? That George Bush's plaintive question, which has actually been asked for a long time. And we have answers to it. Back to the 1950s from the internal declassified record. So Eisenhower, for example, raised exactly the same question back in 1958. He said, look, secretly, in secret discussion, he said, there's a campaign of hatred against us in the same area of the world, not by governments, but by the population. And what's the reason? And the National Security Council gave him the reason. And the reason is that there's a perception, which we can't counter because it's true, that the U.S. supports a harsh and brutal status quo in order to pursue its own interests in obtaining the energy resources of the region, and therefore supports brutal and oppressive regimes. And we have a hard time dealing with this because the perception's correct. And they say it's natural that we should do that. Yeah, that's not very different from what the Wall Street Journal reported a couple of days after the September 11th attacks, when, to their credit, they began to do some studies which should have been done long before, asking what are people's attitudes in that region. Of course, they looked at a narrow sector, the sector they're interested in, what they called moneyed Muslims, the rich guys. So they were thinking of bankers and professionals and international lawyers and people, businessmen, tied up with U.S. multinationals, people who are right in the middle of the U.S. system, and they found pretty much the same responses as back in the 1950s. And that perception still is correct, so it's hard to counter. But it shouldn't be correct. We should not be supporting harsh and brutal regimes. We should not be blocking, as we have been for 50 years there, democratic options, possibilities of independent development. And we shouldn't be carrying out the kinds of policies that really anger people, like supporting the Israeli occupation, which is now in its 35th year and is harsh and brutal, or devastating the civilian population of Iraq while strengthening Saddam Hussein. And they remember, even if we prefer to forget it, that the U.S. and Britain supported Saddam strongly right through his worst atrocities. So like when you hear Madeleine Albright or Tony Blair or somebody saying, this guy is so awful, got to get rid of him, he even gassed his own population. All of that stuff is exactly correct, except they're missing a couple of words. Namely, he gassed his own population with our support, which continued strongly after he did it, because we didn't care about the crimes, cared about other things. We cared about exactly what the National Security Council was telling Eisenhower back in the 1950s. Well, you know, if we don't want to pay any attention to that, okay, then we're just guaranteeing further terrorist acts. Can't predict what they'll be, but you can be pretty sure they'll come. Just as in the case of, say, Britain and Ireland, if they paid no attention to the grievances, it would go on. You know, there's some chance of dealing with problems if you pay attention to what lies behind them. Otherwise, there isn't. And there usually is something behind them. Yep. What does the role of Central Asian oil and other resources play in the current operations in Afghanistan, specifically a pipeline through Afghanistan? Well, you know, anything that happens in that area of the world, there's going to be very likely there'll be an energy connection, because that's why that area of the world is important to the West. That's true of Central Asia. It's far more true of the Gulf region. However, that can't be the reason why the U.S. is bombing Afghanistan. I mean, those interests are constant. They've been there for a long time. They're going to stay there. They didn't change on September 11th. But now they certainly enter. So, for example, George Bush's representative in Afghanistan, Khalilzad, he was, in fact, a consultant for Unocal. And it's not very surprising. Unical's been trying to put a pipeline through there for some years. How important it is, you can debate. It's probably not all that important, but of some interest to them. One consequence of the current war, which is very visible, and the Europeans are well aware of it, in fact, it's all over the business press, is that the U.S. is establishing, and it's pretty obvious if you just look, the U.S. is establishing a military presence in Central Asia, supporting regimes which are scarcely different from the Taliban. It's pretty hard to distinguish Uzbekistan from the Taliban, and that's actually been reported honestly in the New York Times and elsewhere. And it's establishing a military presence there, linking up, as usual, with brutal, repressive, murderous states, you know, horrible attitudes towards women, the usual business. And it's because it wants a position, you know, to take a position in what used to be called in the 19th century the Great Game, you know, the conflict over control of the region. Now that Great Game has different players, you know, then it was Britain and Russia, and different interests. Because now a major interest is who's going to get access to the energy resources of the Central Asia region, which are apparently significant. As far as anybody knows, they're nowhere near on the scale of the Gulf. I mean, Saudi Arabia, as far as anyone knows, remains by far the largest energy source in the world, and Iraq second. But they're not insignificant, you know, and control over them will be important. The Russians want to have control. China wants a peace. The U.S. wants a peace. There's a lot of struggle over whether a pipeline should go through Iran the way the energy companies want, because it's the cheapest way, but the U.S. government doesn't want for reasons you know, or whether it should go through Turkey, which is the main U.S. ally, and a lot of jockeying is going around, and a position of power, military base in Central Asia would give the U.S. some leverage on that, and that's certainly one very likely outcome of the current war. Other things, well, you know, most of this stuff is secret, so we really don't know. But it happened. I was in India in November and passed through Pakistan for a couple of days at the end, and I happened to be in Islamabad for a day, which was the same day as the meetings of the World Bank and the UN Development Fund on late November on development projects for post-war Afghanistan. The Pakistani press, which is surprisingly free and open, at least surprised me, though I sort of knew it from reading Iqbal Ahmed's work, but it's true. They were reporting it pretty straight, and they quoted drafts of World Bank documents which are being presented at the meeting. Actually, I put one of them up on the internet if you're interested. But what it said, I mean, I can't check the original to see if it's accurate. These are internal documents of the World Bank and people like that. But it looked authentic. They were saying that a priority for the reconstruction of Afghanistan should be investment in the energy sector, including pipelines, and then it went on about that. And, you know, those are obviously not the priorities for a country that's been devastated primarily by the U.S. and Russia for the last 20 years and is a total wreck. But if this is correct, that's the projection of the international institutions and their concerns. Maybe, maybe not, until these institutions become transparent enough so that one can find out what they're up to. We'll just have to speculate and use what bits of information there are. But it wouldn't surprise me. That's how this region has been viewed. So yes, there are Central Asian energy interests related to it, and they'll probably become more important in the coming years, with a very likely conflict among China, Russia, United States, other smaller, participants and antagonists. Could be a difficult area. Okay.
Can you speak about the current trend of equating protest with terrorism, on how the media, government, and people of the U.S. view these protests, for example, anti-globalization protests?
Well, it was completely obvious the first moment after September 11th. I have to say, when I was first asked by reporters for comments within a couple of hours, the first thing that came to mind is what I suppose is obvious, that every harsh and repressive force in the world is going to use this as a window of opportunity to pursue their own agendas. I mean, it might be, say, massacring people in Chechnya, or it might be disciplining the population in the United States and trying to get them to shut up while we rich and powerful guys do whatever we want, like cut capital gains taxes and things like that. And that's exactly what happened. I mean, if anybody's surprised, they're just not living in this world. I mean, what do you expect powerful groups to do when they have an opportunity? Use it, of course. So in the United States, for example, the Bush administration has used the opportunity in a particularly crude and vulgar fashion, I mean, exploiting the fear and anguish of the population in order to ram through programs they know they could never get through if there was any discussion and debate. Their favorite programs. I mean, you read the newspapers, I don't have to run through it. What's called anti-globalization, which is a terrible word, incidentally. I mean, it's a term of propaganda, remember. We should never use that term. There is nobody who's opposed to globalization. So, for example, in fact, the main, the modern left, the left in the modern sense, the workers' movement of the left, I mean, after all, it began with and retains a commitment to globalization. That's what the First International was about. What's an international? I mean, it was interested in international integration, but in a form which serves the interests of the general public, not a small sector of investors and lenders. What's called globalization is a specific form of economic integration, which happens to benefit the interests of those who designed it, not very surprisingly. And the interests of everybody else are kind of incidental. They could be harmed, benefited, doesn't matter. Well, that's called globalization, and therefore anybody who's opposed to it is called anti-globalization. So then they can be described as, primitives who want to go back to the Stone Age or something like that. But that's all just pure propaganda. I mean, the question is, what form of international integration do we want? So next week, there's going to be 2 meetings about this. One of them in New York. That's the Davos meetings. Another one in Porto Alegre in Brazil. It's the World Social Forum. Davos is the people who the leading business journal in the world, the Financial Times, at their last meeting called the Masters of the Universe. There was a touch of irony in that, but not very much. It's pretty accurate. So there'll be a basically secret meeting of the Masters of the Universe here in New York. And there'll be a very public meeting in Porto Alegre of popular groups from all over the world and so on and so forth. Jeff's going to be there, I'm going to be there, lots of other people from all over the world will. Well, they're all in favor of globalization. The question is, what form should it take? So none of the people in Porto Alegre are opposed to globalization. That is, they're not opposed to the fact that they're going to be in Porto Alegre, right, which is a kind of globalization. These are terms of propaganda. We should drop them. The question is, what kind of international integration should there be, you know? And there are a lot of different ideas about that. Of course, those who want to ram through their program, people will be meeting in the Davos meeting, they would like everyone else to shut up so they can do what they want without anybody paying any attention to it. And anybody who criticizes it can now be called anti-patriotic or anti-American or, you know, moral relativist or one of the other terms of abuse. But that's just ludicrous. I mean, it's, you know, it's nothing. I mean, the first reaction of the U.S. Trade Representative, Robert Zoellick, to the terrorist attacks was that if you're opposed to terrorism, you have to grant the president Stalinist-style authority to reach international agreements without congressional involvement or public knowledge. There's a name for that. It's called fast track or trade enhancement. It's like the old Kremlin days. That's the way you're going to make Osama bin Laden, you know, quake in his boots if you give the president that authority. And that's what they managed to get it. You know, they managed to ram it through Congress, I think, with one vote by pleading patriotism. Well, yeah, sure, that's exactly what they're going to do. I mean, they would do that if there was an earthquake. You know, whatever is going to happen. Yes, they'll try to use that opportunity. This one happens to be particularly vulgar. And in fact, things like the disgracefully named U.S. Patriot Act, which is really reminiscent of Stalinism, including its wording. Yeah, they'll try to impose things like that using the current fear and concerns of the population. Naturally, that's what you do if you're in power. But there's no reason why it should succeed. My suspicion is it probably won't. But that's in our hands, really. You know, are you going to subject yourself to efforts at imposing submissiveness and discipline or not? There's no more reason to shut up about things you think are important now than there were pre-September 11th. Certainly, people with power aren't shutting up. They're doing exactly what they always do, figuring they have a chance to do it even more easily under these conditions.
I think there's time for 2 more questions.
Okay.
I'll read this one. What do you want some water?
No.
What do you think the Al Gore response would have been to September 11th?
Probably about the same. I can't see. I don't. You know. Yeah.
Is that enough of an answer? Yeah.
I mean, I should say, you know, these are distinctions that are, differences that are awfully hard to make. I mean, like, for example, in 1968, if you wanted U.S. troops out of Vietnam, should you have voted for Humphrey or Nixon? Well, you know, personally, I didn't vote. But my feeling was probably it would be more likely with Nixon. And in retrospect, I think it's probably true. You know, these are differences that are so marginal and subtle that to take a position on them is almost impossible. You know?
Maybe we can get through 2 more. We have to finish about 5 minutes. Is there this came from many different people, is there credible evidence that some part of the U.S. government was complicit in the September 11th attacks?
Well, that's an internet theory, but it's hopelessly implausible in my opinion. So hopelessly implausible, I don't even see any point talking about it. I don't think so.
I think you can read this.
Yeah. Has the U.S. now found or created a satisfactory substitute for the Cold War? That means, I presume, the war on terrorism. Well, you see, going back to our Martian, he could tell you right off that that can't possibly be true. And the reason is because the war on terrorism was declared in 1981 with the same rhetoric and the same people, and we know how it was waged. Now, nobody wants to talk about that for a very good reason. If you talk about it, you come up with the kinds of answers that actually we all know that I reviewed, so therefore you can't talk about it. But it's a fact, nevertheless. And in fact, you have to ask what the Cold War was. Well, you know, one of the reason that they came up with the war against terror as the core of U.S. foreign policy in the early 80s was because everybody realized the Cold War is not going to serve as a pretext for very long. You know, gonna have to find other pretexts for the kinds of policies that are carried out before the Cold War, after the Cold War, during the Cold War, for the same reasons. Let's go back to Eisenhower. Things I was, I didn't have a chance to quote them, but the things I was referring to about, why do they hate us? Here are the reasons from the National Security Council. That happened to be 1958. It was a very important year in U.S. and world history for a lot of reasons. Actually, the U.S. faced 3 major crises that year, according to internal debate. We have a huge internal record on this. It'd be front-page news in Mars because it goes right up to the present. Everything that happened then goes right up to the present. And we know a lot about it because it's declassified. So any journalist who wants to find out, just open the official records. Same with any commentator. 1958, the Eisenhower administration identified 3 major crises in the world, all in Islamic states, all in oil producers. One was Indonesia, one was Algeria, one was the Middle East. What had happened in Algeria was that the French, which is an oil producer, the French were having a hard time suppressing a national independence movement despite huge massacres and terror and savagery, and that was bad. In Indonesia, the problem was that the government was too independent and too democratic. It was allowing a party of the left to participate, a party of the peasants, and it was getting more and more, it was gaining more and more, and in fact it looked like they might actually take over the government, or at least become influential. In the Middle East, what was happening was that Iraq broke out of the Anglo-American condominium over energy. Iran had tried with a conservative nationalist government, but they were put back in their place by a U.S.-British coup. But Iraq actually got out. It was assumed to be Nasserite, that is, independent nationalist. There was discussion internally. Instantly, every one of those 3 crises goes right up until today. The U.S. reacted in Indonesia by organizing the biggest clandestine operation in post-war history to try to break up Indonesia and to take over the outer islands where most of the resources are. Failed and led to things we don't have to talk about. In the Middle East, it's quite interesting what happened. Among other things, the U.S. sent troops to Lebanon. My wife, who does the New York Times crossword puzzle, asked me the other night around 1 o'clock in the morning what I thought the answer was to a 7-letter blank space for U.S. peacekeeping operation in 1958. I tore my hair out thinking it can't be this, but I said, well, maybe Lebanon. Lebanon was a U.S. invasion. It wasn't a peacekeeping mission, which said, in fact, the U.S. troops that landed were authorized to use nuclear weapons, apparently. It was connected with Iraq's breakaway. What happened in Lebanon afterwards, I don't have to describe to you. This goes straight up to the Gulf War. You take a look at the meetings between Britain and the United States, then they lay it all out. Okay, it's right up to the present. Same in Algeria. There's monstrous terrorist acts going on, a lot of them by the government, a lot of them probably supported by French intelligence. Very messy story. Anyway, they're all going on ever since. There was discussion internally. It was naturally raised. What's the role of the Russians in all this? And the conclusion was nothing. Eisenhower, in fact, himself intervened, according to the minutes, vociferously to say there's no Russian involvement in any of this. That's very typical. If you look at the internal record, we have a rich internal record about intervention throughout the Third World. Turns out the Cold War is mostly a pretext. It was a pretext for, of course, there's a superpower conflict in the background. And each superpower, for completely cynical reasons, supported the opponents of the other, just like the U.S. organized radical Islamic fanatics in Afghanistan in the 1980s. But that's for cynical internal reasons. It had nothing to do with the Cold. The actual struggles were different. The Russians used the Cold War as a pretext for intervention in their own domains. We used the Cold War as a pretext for intervention in our much broader domains. That's true in case after case. There's no time to run through it, but the evidence, case by case, is quite substantial. So it's true that there's a need for a substitute for the Cold War as a pretext. In fact, a month after this was obvious, a month after the Berlin Wall fell, Berlin Wall fell in November 1989. Okay, that ended any. Oh, going back to why international terrorism, they were looking for something. What are we going to use if the Russians aren't there? So, you know, Hispanic narco-traffickers, international terrorists, something or other. This came to a head in November 1989. Berlin Wall fell, absolutely no possibility of pretending the Russians are coming. What happened right after? Well, the first thing that happened is the U.S. stepped up its terrorist attacks against Nicaragua. Another thing that happened is the U.S. invaded Panama. The Panamanians don't think this is particularly trivial. Like, for example, the Panamanian press, like everywhere, denounced the September 11th atrocities very harshly, but they added, as did many people around the world, we're not unfamiliar with it. In Panama, they referred to the bombing of the Barrio Chorrillo, a slum where, according to them, a couple thousand people were killed in one bombing raid. We don't know whether that's true because it's a Western crime, so therefore it's never investigated. That's the same principle, but could be true. The U.S. invaded Panama, certainly killed a lot of people, vetoed 2 Security Council resolutions. The purpose was to kidnap a thug, minor thug, not a Saddam Hussein, who was brought to Florida, tried, and convicted for crimes that he committed mostly when he was on the CIA payroll. Well, you know, that's like a footnote to history. You don't even mention it. But it was after the Cold War, so it had to have different pretexts, and it did. It was to defend ourselves against Hispanic narco-traffickers. It wasn't because the Russians were coming. Also, as the current human rights advisor to the National Security Council, Elliot Abrams, advised, he had just been kicked out of the government for crimes. He pointed out correctly that this is the first time that the United States can carry out an intervention without any concern that the Soviet Union might react somewhere in the world, you know, for their own reasons, but use the opportunity. So now we don't have to worry about it. We can just intervene straight out. Other than tactics and pretexts, it's the same as everything else. And it continues that way right through the 90s. And in fact, it was that way before the Cold War broke out. I mean, Cold War began in 1918. You know, right before that, Wilson had invaded Haiti and the Dominican Republic, devastating invasions. But that was to protect us against the Huns, because the Russians weren't there yet. And so it goes. I mean, and we know that it's mostly a pretext. I mean, there's a superpower conflict in the background, but pretext. In fact, that became extremely clear I mean, anybody who wanted to know anything about this would certainly have looked at a public document, namely George Bush I's first presentation to Congress calling for a huge military budget after the fall of the Berlin Wall, right? There's one every year. So the interesting one was, well, what about the one in March 1990? And it was interesting. It was the same as all the others. You know, we need a huge military budget, but it wasn't to defend ourselves against the Russians, because you couldn't pretend that anymore. We needed a huge military budget because of, actually I'm quoting, the technological sophistication of third world countries. That's why we needed it. And then also we had to maintain what was called the defense industrial base. That's a euphemism for high-tech industry. I shouldn't complain about it. It pays my salary for the last 50 years. But the way you maintain high-tech industry is by socializing the cost and privatizing the gain. And one of the ways of doing that is under the cover of the military budget. So we have to maintain the defense industrial base to maintain the very dynamic state sector of the economy. I say we have to maintain the huge intervention forces, which had always been aimed at the Middle East and have to continue to be aimed at the Middle East. Then came an interesting phrase. We have to maintain intervention forces aimed at the Middle East. Now, quoting, where the threats to our interests that required intervention could not be laid at the Kremlin's door, okay? So, but sorry, folks, we've been lying to you for 50 years, but we still need them. And we need them for exactly the reasons that were brought up in 1958, and in fact throughout the whole period, because of independent nationalism and the threat that it poses. However, the clouds lifted at this point. You know, you couldn't pretend anymore that it was the Russians. Incidentally, the threats could not be laid at Saddam Hussein's door because he was a friend and ally at that time. It was a couple of months later that he committed his first crime and disobeyed orders. And so there you have it. I mean, sort of spelled out. And everything that happened since supports it. In fact, you know, it's not that the Cold War didn't exist. You know, it's not, in fact, it came close to blowing up the world several times. It was real. But it's not primarily a superpower conflict. It was primarily what's called a North-South conflict. It used to be called imperialism in the old days. We don't like that word anymore. So it's what's called a North-South conflict, and the concern was primarily independent nationalism and what was called its virus effect. You might have a virus that would infect others, you know. So Cuba, let's say. The U.S., for years, the pretense was we have to carry out terrorist actions against Cuba, and they have been extremely severe, and an embargo which is very harsh, the harshest in the world, even food and medicine. And we need that because it's a tentacle of the Russian Empire. You know, it's going to strangle us, just like Nicaragua was going to conquer the world. That's why we needed it. In 1989, that was gone. So we had to have some other reason for maintaining it. Notice that it all got harsher after 1989. So you need it with some other pretext. We also know why it started, because now we have the declassified records. So the U.S. decision to overthrow the government of Cuba actually was considered in the summer of 1959. That's after about 2 months by the National Security Council, 2 months after Castro took over. But it was formally made in March 1960. There's no Russian connection. In fact, you know, they knew Castro was regarded as anti-communist. The Kennedy administration came in. They were going to focus on Latin America. So Kennedy naturally had a Latin American mission, which was headed by historian Arthur Schlesinger, who you know. He submitted a report to the incoming president of the conclusions of the mission, and of course he discussed Cuba, and he discussed the Cuban threat. The Cuban threat is the threat of the spread of the Castro idea of taking matters into your own hands. And then he pointed out that's an idea that has a lot of appeal around Latin America, where impoverished people are facing very similar problems. He mentioned a Russian connection, namely, the Russians are hovering in the background, offering development loans and presenting themselves as a model for development in a single generation. It's another case of the virus threat. Those are the reasons. You know, then came the terrorism, the Bay of Pigs, the whole business. And if you look case after case, that's what you find. You know, I can't try to prove it now, but there's a ton of stuff in print about this. So what about a substitute for the Cold War? Yeah, well, you're going to have other pretexts. And the new phase of the war on terrorism, remember it's 20 years old, is a search for some such pretext. It's not that it isn't real, that terrorism's real enough, it's some small part of it, but it's real. But it is going to be used as a pretext for everything else, whether it's giving the president, you know, the right to negotiate agreements in secret, or, you know, cutting taxes on the rich, or forcing people to shut up, or intervening somewhere, or whatever. Yeah, it'll be used for those purposes. I want to thank Noam Chomsky for being Noam Chomsky. I want to let you know that Free Speech Television has recorded this, as has C-SPAN.
and you can contact C-SPAN to find out when it will air. If you're not a subscriber to Fairs Extra, please do so. And I want to thank the people that do all the work, which is the Fair staff. And I want to thank the wonderful Phil Donahue and Laura Flanders.
Noam Chomsky has written and lectured widely on linguistics, philosophy, international affairs, and U.S. foreign policy. His books include Language and Mind, Profit Over People, Rogue States, and his latest, 9/11. It's published by Open Media, a division of 7 Stories Press. For more information, visit their website, 7stories.com.
"48 hours of nonfiction books on TV. You're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2.
Coming up, we'll take you to the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. for a discussion on globalization with Tomas Larsson, author of The Race to the Top. Then Jack Germond, former columnist for the Baltimore Sun, on 40 years of covering national politics, Fat Man in a Middle Seat. Next week on Book TV, a look at the lives of African Americans at the turn of the 21st century with Randall Keenan, author of Walking on Water. After that, on Public Lives, Vermont Senator Jim Jeffords discusses his memoir of leaving the Republican Party, My Declaration of Independence. Later, a revisionist history of the Second World War's Pacific Theater. In his new book, Empires on the Pacific, author Robert Smith Thompson explains the strategy of Japan and the United States for the control of Asia.
Better than it was. And those achievements have come by people who didn't just ask the question, but acted on the obvious answer. And there isn't going to be any other answer. There's no point asking. If anybody had thought of an answer, you would have heard it. And there isn't any. The answer is, just do it. And you know how to do it the same way everybody else does.
If bombing Afghanistan is the wrong way of going about solving terrorism, then what is a better alternative? Thanks.
Yeah. Well, first of all, we have to decide what we mean by terrorism. Do we mean by terrorism what the, say, U.S. Code means by terrorism? Or do we mean by terrorism the terrorism that they conduct against us? Okay. Those are, depending on what we mean, there are different answers. So are we hypocrites or not? We got to decide that first. Well, if we're not hypocrites, then one way to reduce terrorism doesn't solve it. One way to reduce terrorism is not to participate in it. That's an easy way. That doesn't take, doesn't take bombing, doesn't take embargoes. It just means stop participating in it. If you want to know what that means, let's say today, just take a look at the list of leading recipients of U.S. arms transfers in the world. Just run through the list, compare them with called on Israel, meaning the U.S. and Israel, to observe international law. The U.S. boycotted the meeting, thereby killing it. You can check the coverage again. These acts, again, contribute to the escalation of terrorism there, including its most severe component, and the media contributed in the usual way. Well, suppose, finally, that we join the Martian Observer. I'm skipping a lot of things I think are interesting. You can ask about them if you like. But suppose, finally, that we join the Martian Observer and we depart from convention radically. We accept moral truisms. If we can rise to that level, we can then, and only then, honestly raise the question of how to respond to terrorist crimes. One answer is to follow the precedent of law-abiding states. the Nicaraguan precedent, for example. Of course, that failed because they ran up against the fact that the world is ruled by force, not by law, but wouldn't fail for the U.S. However, evidently that's excluded. I have yet to see one phrase referring to that precedent in the massive coverage of the last couple of months. Another answer was given by Bush and Boyce, but we instantly reject that one because nobody believes that Haiti or Nicaragua...
Do as individuals and collectively do to change this pattern of U.S. abuses and murder? How can we engage and inspire those outside this hall being full of the already converted and privileged?
First of all, an apology. If I act as if I can't see you, that's because I can't see you. It's all black out there. I assume there must be people, but can't see any faces. Actually, first of all, there are plenty of people outside this hall who are pretty much the same. In fact, it's a very powerful current in the country and, in fact, throughout the world. There's plenty of evidence for that. As to what you can do about it, I think we all know the answer. I mean, ask yourself why we don't live under feudalism, or why we don't have slavery, or why women have some rights, or why there's some finally concern about trying to save the environment before we destroy it, or anything else you can think of back through history. There are no magic answers. There's only one answer. It's dedicated, committed, hard work. Educational, organizing, find the things that interest you, get involved in them. There's just no other way. That's the way it's been done all through history. It's had a lot of progress. Things can make a lot of terrible things in the world, but it's a lot. The easy answer is conventional hypocrisy. The other option is the one adopted by our Martian friend, who actually abides by the principles that we profess with grand self-righteousness. That option is harder to consider, but imperative if the world is to be spared still worse disasters. Thanks.
The quicker we take our break, the quicker he comes back. We're going to take a 10-minute break. You can buy books and T-shirts, write out your questions. People will be going down here, a couple people picking up questions, and up there, and we're going to start again in 10 minutes. Stretch your legs. Thank you. Oh, the questions keep coming. I'll read them.
Okay.
What can we do?
Or Cuba and a long list of others around the world have the right to carry out massive terrorist attacks against the United States and its clients or other rich and powerful states. A more reasonable answer was given by from a number of sources, including the Vatican, and was spelled out by the preeminent Anglo-American military historian, Michael Howard, last October. Actually, it's published in the current issue of Foreign Affairs. That's the leading establishment journal. Howard has all the appropriate credentials, a lot of prestige. He's a great admirer of the British Empire, even more extravagantly of its successor in global rule, so he can't be accused of moral relativism or other such crimes. Referring to September 11th, he recommended then a police operation against a criminal conspiracy whose members should be hunted down and brought before an international court where they could receive a fair trial and, if found guilty, be awarded an appropriate sentence. Well, that was never contemplated, of course, but sounds kind of reasonable to me. If it is reasonable, then it ought to hold for even worse terrorist crimes. For example, the U.S. International terrorist attack against Nicaragua, or even worse ones nearby and elsewhere, going up right to the present, incidentally. Well, that could never be contemplated, of course, but for opposite reasons. So honesty leaves us with a dilemma.